This is essentially a PowerPoint presentation that I prepared a few years ago. Now get used to this. You're going to be hearing it 5 times a day, including an hour before sunrise.
Oh boy.
And after sunset. It's the call to prayer. And this actually is what he's saying. This, by the way, the picture was out of the hotel window where we used to stay. We're not staying there this time, but used to stay in Konya with the mosque right next door. And it was quite an experience to hear this come through the loudspeaker at about 5 a.m.
So we'll have no trouble making
Yeah,
that
no,
exactly.
Right.
7:30
7
bus.
a.m. breakfast
We'll
is
be right
fine.
there.
Yeah.
Wide awake.
Not a problem.
So when you hear it, the first words, although it never quite sounds like it, the first words are Allahu Akbar. And you sometimes can pick up because they'll go, Akbar!
Oh.
But Allahu Akbar is God is great. And this is in Arabic, it's not in Turkish. There was a period whereby by state law, the call to prayer, I mean, the state was so regimenting, restricting religions, including Muslims, that the state required that the call to prayer be in Turkish, not Arabic. But in the last 10 years, there has been a great deal more freedom of religion, both for Muslims, who are 99% of the population, and for the others. It's not perfect. You know, there's still controversy about women's headscarves and restrictions on them and all of that. It's interesting where, you know, right next door, the women have to be covered up completely. And in Turkey, up until recently, they were not allowed in the university wearing a headscarf. A pious Muslim woman who wanted a university education had to go to another country in order to attend the university in her headscarf. So that's the way I would characterize it is Turkey is now coming, you know, they're talking about it swinging over into, and it's becoming Islamist. My personal take on it is the end of a militant secularist rule that is trying to discover how to grant religious freedom across the board. Recognizing, too, I think, that we're going to have, there's going to have to be a certain favoritism to the religion of 99% of the people. And how you balance that with the minorities that are less than 1%, like Greek Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, Roman Catholic, other Eastern Catholic, and Jews, is always going to be a point of controversy, no matter what. So the call to prayer is essentially what you see here. God is great. I bear witness that there is no God except the one God. Now, Allah is actually Arabic for the God. And I always, in my translating of it, say the one God, because the second part of it, the part, or la part, could refer to God with a small g. But the God is what Allah means. So it's not a proper name. It is the God. So, I bear witness that there is no God except the one God. I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of the one God. Come to prayer. Come to prosperity. God is great. There is no God worthy to be worshipped except the one God. Who can argue with that?
That's right.
So,
Allah Akbar.
now, as I understand it, this is the call to prayer for all of the 5 hours of prayer. With the exception of the early morning one, the 5 a.m. or whatever time, it's based on the sunrise time. That adds the phrase, prayer is better than sleep, for obvious reasons. So, let me. By the way, this is on YouTube, largely because my own files are in such disarray that I wasn't able to find my own recording. This was recorded in Sultanahmet Square, where about 3 or 4 other mosques are going on at the same time. That's an interesting experience to hear the call to prayer coming at you from different directions, sort of out of sync with one another. Okay. Let's.
Father, do they keep repeating this same prayer? Because it seems like it goes on and on for a while. I just wondered if it was repeated.
Yeah, I think it is.
Okay.
Okay, what do I want to do here? I guess they're finished.
That's a good move.
So, understanding Islam. I basically drew this up for us as Catholics to be able to, how can we understand the basics of Islam? How can we kind of get into the mind of what Muslims value? So talk about beliefs, origins, history, and implications for today. There are 2 fundamental things to keep in mind. What I was just saying, Allah literally means the one God. And Muslims acknowledge their kinship with Jews and Christians as people of the book. And the Quran calls for a different approach to the people of the book and non-believers. The people of the book are never supposed to be called infidels, even though they are often. I mean, they make exceptions for a variety of reasons. And part of the, as we'll see later, part of the problem is who is the they.
And what is the book?
Oh.
Well, we'll see about the book in a minute when we get into the Quran. But, well, no, you don't have to wait, because they acknowledge that the Quran has a continuity with the Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospels. So they will acknowledge the authenticity of Christian books and Jewish books, which have been, in their mind, distorted, for which the Quran is now the culmination and fulfillment. So they don't deny the books as revelations from God, but they do say they were distorted by their followers. One of the things that I think is attractive to many people, Christians included, and there's more converts to Islam from Christians than most of us would be comfortable with. But the simplicity of belief. You start probing Christianity and you come up with a very complex, complicated belief structure. You look at Islam, and at least what unifies most Muslims is a very simple, direct belief structure, and which is called the 6 pillars, or sometimes 5 pillars, and a very simple, direct set, 6 pillars of faith, I should say, and a very simple, direct practice, which is the 5 pillars of Islam. So these pillars of faith: belief in God, belief in God's angels, belief in God's prophets, belief in God's books, belief in the day of judgment and resurrection, and belief in God's will. That is it for Islam as far as the actual core of faith is concerned. Now, when you talk about belief in one God, what do we mean by one God? Well, it's opposed to idols and polytheism. It also is, and I probably should rephrase that the next time I go through this, not so much as opposed to Christian belief in the Trinity, but as distinct from Christian belief in the Trinity. There are areas in the Quran where God seems to be speaking as ridiculing the idea that God could have a son, that God could generate a son. And that is, basically saying those Christians are, they have distorted. They have departed from the revelation that God had given them in the prophet Jesus, by making Jesus to be the Son of God. What I think Christians looking at that would say, we don't believe the way that you are rejecting it. We don't believe in that physical idea of generation the way that you guys, the way that the Quran is rejecting it. So in a sense, we would almost say you are setting up a straw man to knock him down, when that really isn't our faith that you're knocking down. Our belief in the Trinity is much more subtle than what they are saying. We will get into this a little, probably a lot more, if we work on any kind of further understanding when we're on the bus and on the trip. So I really won't say much more about it. There are, from the Quran and various traditions, 99 names or attributes of God. Those are things like the merciful, the strong, the mighty, the loving, the everlasting, the beginning, the last, the receiver of repentance, the caring, the bringer of peace, the avenger of evil, the living, the faithful, and so on. You know those prayer beads? 99 of them? That's for what they're doing as they're fingering those prayer beads, sort of like a rosary. We do the Hail Marys, they're doing the 99 names of God. So, Second part, belief in God's angels. Gabriel revealed the Quran to Muhammad. It's very interesting. They very much acknowledge that Gabriel revealed the conception, the virginal conception of Jesus to Mary. So they see Gabriel as the messenger to Muhammad, bringing God's word, just as he was the messenger to Mary, that she would conceive virginally the prophet Jesus. Now, if Mary conceived virginally the prophet Jesus, isn't that just a tiny short step to saying, you know, who was acting as father there except God?
Mm-hmm.
But they don't go there. They also believe in a variety of spiritual beings, similar to both Jewish and Christian traditions, including Shaitan, or Satan, the tempter, and jinn, genies, lesser angels, who are both good and rebellious. And some of them just mischievous. Not evil, but mischievous. Which kind of corresponds to human experience, you know. If you can't explain something, well, it was an angel, or it was a... Third is the belief in God's prophets. The Quran names about 28 prophets, many of whom are also in the Bible, like Adam, Noah, Abraham, Ishmael, Lot, Moses, Job, David, Solomon, and Jesus. And then Muhammad is seen as the last of all prophets. The message of the previous prophets was rejected or distorted by their followers, Jews or Christians. That's what they will hold. Notice they see their kinship with Jews in the common ancestry of Abraham. And the Jewish tradition, as the Arab tradition, is that the Jews came from Abraham through Isaac, and the Arabs came from Abraham through Ishmael. So in the Quran and in Islamic tradition, you know that sacrifice of Isaac?
Mm-hmm.
You know, the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, which we will hear in 2 weeks at the Easter Vigil. Well, the Quran repeats it as that being Abraham and Ishmael. And where did that take place? Mecca. And this mountain right outside of Mecca was the mountain of sacrifice for Ishmael, and God stayed his hand. So that's the Quranic tradition of that. And as we'll see later, the Kaaba in Mecca, that stone building, square, cube, stone building, that was traditionally built by Abraham in commemoration of that event of God saving Ishmael from the sacrifice to be the father of the people. So there's a kinship there that goes way, way back, and on the other hand, who fights each other with more hatred than brothers? You know, family feuds are often the most deadly. So, fourth pillar of belief is belief in God's books. The Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospels are considered holy books, but incomplete and subsequently distorted. The Quran is complete and uncorrupted revelation, the final edition. In that, it's difficult not to see a little bit of a parallel with Mormonism, isn't it? Since they see the Book of Mormon as being the final revelation of God. So we're people of the book for them too. We're brothers. Since we as Christians kind of come from Judaism with our faith coming through Isa, which is Arabic for Jesus. Isa, the prophet. So, Jesus is seen as a true prophet, misrepresented by his followers. Mary is honored, the virgin birth is recognized, but not Jesus' divinity, nor his crucifixion. So they say that he was not crucified, that was a fabrication later on. He's also seen as having predicted a final prophet after him. You go into the life...
That is yet to come?
No, that's
No,
Muhammad.
that's Muhammad.
Oh, Muhammad. Oh, got you. Okay.
And that seemed to also have been a little something of a distorted Christian tradition among the monks of the outlying areas. You know, a lot of the reaction, I think, of Islam to Christianity comes from the distorted and maybe heretical versions of it that were alive at the time, because you know, we're just at that point coming out of the time when the Trinity and the nature and meaning of Jesus, divine and human, you know, had been defined by the councils, and there was still just a lot of variations of belief going on at that time. So, we don't yet accept God's final revelation, which is one reason why, their missionaries stand to non-Jews and non-Christians is, you accept monotheism, we are presenting you with monotheism. Their stand towards Jews and Christians is, we are the culmination. We are the fulfillment of what you believe. And that's why, for a Muslim to convert to Judaism or to convert to Christianity is seen as a fatal step backward in faith. And so they, it's very difficult for them to recognize even the kind of legitimacy of personal conscience that we might recognize in even a conversion of a Christian. We would say, well, I didn't really understand Christianity, who might embrace Islam. We would be inclined to recognize that freedom of conscience, although it was pretty hard won, because it's only with the Second Vatican Council that the Church officially did recognize religious freedom. Prior to that, even the state was supposed to uphold the truth of the Catholic Church, opposing all other forms of religion, including other Christians. Where Muslims are now, in the exclusivity of their faith, is where we were not that many years ago, in saying outside the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, there is no salvation. That was the teaching up until not terribly long ago. Okay. See, all of this could be unfolded so much more in commentary. Belief in the day of judgment and resurrection. Quran is very strong in symbolic images and details of heaven and hell, but there really isn't a coherent picture. But that yes, there is judgment. Yes, there is resurrection. Yes, there is an eternity of promise for good and punishment for evil. And there is also a sense that, even though it uses sometimes the language of eternal fire and all of that, The question could always be asked, what really does eternity mean? And maybe it's not eternal for all. Maybe if God's mercy is infinite, we'll leave that to God's mercy. That may be a little bit more explicit in Muslim faith than it is in ours. Not necessarily in Muslim extremists, however. And then belief in the will of God, that God's will is ultimately responsible for all that happens. A pious Muslim will always be using the expression, inshallah, God willing. If God wills it, it will be. And they don't deny free will, that we are responsible for what we do, but there is probably, in a pious Muslim, a little more fundamentalist sense of God controlling than what I think most mainstream Christians tend to be comfortable with. Although you find the God controlling idea often enough in Christianity too. So the 5 pillars of Islam, we had the 6 pillars of faith, now we've got the obligatory practice. And as far as obligation imposed upon a Muslim, this is it. Nothing else is in any way universally seen as obligatory for the life of a Muslim. Once again, you've got how would I say, faith and practice in a simple nutshell. You don't have to worry a lot about what to do. You may have to worry about whether you do it or not. But so the first one is shahada, testifying. What makes a Muslim? You are a Muslim if, in the presence of 2 witnesses, you state with full intentionality, I declare that there is no God but God, and I declare that Muhammad is his messenger. Well, for the first half of it, we're all Muslims. We have a little difficulty accepting the second half. But that is the basic content of faith. And the sources of the message of the messenger, the Quran and the Sunnah and the Hadith. The Quran is accepted by everybody. The Sunnah and the Hadith are not accepted by the Shiites. The Sunnah is the way of the prophets, a commentary. And the Hadith, words and deeds of the prophet. So the Sunni Muslims will accept more of a breadth of tradition. Shiites, it's the Quran, and there isn't that tradition. So that's one of the. Salat, praying 5 times a day. Fajr, before sunrise. That's the one that wakes you up. Zuhr, noontime. Ashr, late afternoon. Maghrib, sunset. And Isha at night. It's always interesting looking at the origins of these words, the roots of these words. Arabic is a Semitic language which will have usually 3 consonants as the roots, and vowels or some kind of a sound in between. And you'll notice all of those are actually 2 syllables with 3 consonants. Salat means literally to connect. So praying is connecting. It has a secondary meaning of burning or heat. So a fiery, impassioned connection with Allah. How do you pray? Well, you first of all have to be pure. This is Aiden, our tour guide, demonstrating how they do the washing beforehand. Hands, feet, face, ears, nostrils, and mouth. All are symbolically purified. before prayer, and that's supposed to be done that way 5 times a day. Very strong emphasis in Islam on purity, on cleanliness, and on modesty. And the purpose of prayer is for the human being to present oneself before God as humble servant. How do you pray? As we know, there are postures. And you begin with, God is great. You begin with, in the name of God, the compassionate source of all mercy. All praise to God. You alone do we serve. You alone do we look for help. Guide us on the straight path, the path of those who have earned your favor. That is the first surah of the Quran. That is repeated at every prayer, along with other verses then. And glory to my God, the Great One, God who hears the prayers, who hears those who praise Him. That's the content of the 5 times a day prayer, with some variations. Prayer always towards Mecca. In the beginning, it was towards Jerusalem. But after, and I don't remember exactly what point in the prophet's life, it became revealed, no, you do not pray to the temple in Jerusalem, or towards the temple in Jerusalem, which has a very special meaning for them, and now it is the Dome of the Rock. But you pray towards Mecca, which is the place of the creation of Adam, traditionally, and then Hagar and Ishmael's exile, and then Abraham's sacrifice of Ishmael. Friday prayer, it's doing that prayer, that very same prayer, together, along with the sermon. So it doesn't really have the meaning of our Mass, or even of Christian worship. A mosque is nothing other than a prayer place. It's not a place for any ritual. There really isn't a ritual in Islam. There are rituals, but it's not centered on that. It's centered simply on your individual prayer before God and your on Fridays gathering prayer. Traditionally, the day of gathering was the day on which Adam was created. And it's led not by a priest, but an imam, which simply means a prayer leader. So an imam could actually be anybody. Zakat, almsgiving. Now this is very interesting, that for those who have wealth, giving to the poor is a fundamental obligation. It's not a counsel. It's not a sort of an optional means of perfection. It is part of what must be done to be a Muslim. And it is not an externally imposed tax, but an internal obligation, usually reckoned at 2.5% of your wealth beyond basic necessities. In other words, it's not based on income, but based on what you have at any given time. Each year, 2.5% of what you have over and above your basic need does not belong to you, it belongs to the poor. And interestingly, from the beginning, mosques were never built simply as houses of worship by themselves. They always had shelter, kitchens, serving the poor and homeless, as well as education centers. So, and we'll see a lot of that, the mosque complexes. Sa'um, fasting during Ramadan. During the month of Ramadan, which is a lunar, they follow a lunar calendar, from dawn to dusk, fasting from food, water, and sexual intimacy. That's fasting from food and water is in the northern, near the equator. It's about the same every year. In the northern hemisphere, however, because Ramadan, how would I say, it's a strictly lunar calendar, which does not have any kind of leap month in it, like the Jewish calendar is lunar, but every few years there's a 13th month. They do not do that. So the actual year in Islam is, I believe it's 11 days shorter than the solar year. What that means is the beginning of each month, the new moon, will be 11 days earlier each year than it was the previous year. So Ramadan, as do all the other months, sort of cycle through the seasons. It's interesting that it's hard for us to get a handle on that, but Muslims have lived, and probably Arabs did before Islam, lived very comfortably with an idea of the lunar year governing many aspects of our lives, cycling independently of the cycles of the seasons. So that Ramadan could be, in the winter at one time, and 10, 15 years later, be in the summer. And then back to the winter. Which means, it's nice to be a Muslim when Ramadan is in the wintertime up in Scandinavia, because, you got a couple of hours of fasting, and then once the sun goes down, you don't have to fast anymore. But the discipline of it is, again, in the summertime, it would be not so easy. You don't have much time to break your fast. But it does take discipline, and its purpose is through this discipline, not an end in itself, but heightened spiritual awareness, and the experience of hunger and thirst, leading one to good deeds and solidarity and compassion for the hungry, kind of like a time of training. This is what I was talking about, the cycle through the year. And the Muslims mark the years from Muhammad's migration from Mecca to Medina. And so, if you see things according to the Islamic calendar, you've got to be careful that each Islamic year is actually about 11 and a half months rather than a full year. So when you're doing your math, it can get complicated. The fifth pillar is the Hajj, pilgrimage to Mecca. And we already talked about the meaning of the Kaaba. It's today covered with a black cloth, ritually venerated by pilgrims. Pilgrimage during the time of the Hajj. There is a particular time that the Hajj is required. You can make a pilgrimage to Mecca at another time, but it's not a Hajj. I can't remember what they call it. But during this pilgrimage time, Saudi Arabia's economy, it's not just based on oil, it's based on millions of Muslims coming each year at this particular time on their pilgrimage. And there's ritual gestures. One of the very interesting videos is a National Geographic on the experience of 4 American Muslims preparing for and actually going on the Hajj. And that gives you a very good and clear idea of just what is involved in the Hajj, in this pilgrimage. You've heard of things, Haji Baba? Okay. Baba is Papa, and Haji is somebody who's been on the Hajj. So, Pilgrim Papa would be the, or Pilgrim Grandpa, Haji Baba. By the way, you'll see this written in Turkish, H-A-C. Remember, C is pronounced like J. So, and sometimes you'll see in Turkish, there's a restaurant called Haji Baba, but it's spelled H-A-C-I-B-A-B-A. Purpose of it, honor the faith and life of the prophet Abraham. Notice, not Muhammad. Actually, Medina is seen as Muhammad's city because he was originally in Mecca, but he was thrown out. And but to honor the prophet Abraham. To come together as a community, you often hear the word ummah in Arabic as the Muslim community. To renew commitment to God's way of life, to learn the stark reality of the shortness of this life and one's accountability to God. Here's the demographics of Islam. There are 1.5 billion people, 20% of the world's population. 85% of them are Sunni, 15% Shia. And where do I have it here? I put in here a little bit more on if you're following along here, it's I guess the fourth sheet in comparing. Christians are 2.5 billion. So a lot more Christians still than Muslims. Catholics are fewer than Muslims, 1.2 billion. Interestingly, according to the whatever source that was in Wikipedia, people who acknowledge themselves in some way as secular, atheist, or agnostic are 1.1 billion in our world. That kind of hit me. Hindus are 1 billion. Buddhists are only 376 million. I didn't realize there were that few Buddhists. Jews are only 14 million. Sikhs 28 million and Baha'is 7 million. And so we see also the vast majority of Muslims in the world are not Arabs. And we'll learn a good bit more about that actually on the pilgrimage, because Turks are not Arabs. And you better not confuse the two among either group. That'll be an interesting historical thing. How about the origins of Islam? With regard to the Prophet, Arabia at the time of Muhammad was warring rival pagan tribes surrounded, each one having their own god, and they all had their own little idol in the Kaaba. And Mecca's prosperity depended on these tribes that they were often fighting, and fighting among one another, coming every year to the Kaaba on pilgrimage for their particular idol. So, in other words, this pagan religion, or complexus of religions of the Arab people, that was a source of profit for the Meccans. Which really figures into the history of Muhammad and the history of the beginnings of Islam. Now, surrounded by two very strong empires, the Byzantine Christian Empire and the Zoroastrian Persian Empire. Very interestingly, Muhammad and the early Muslims at least did not feel that this message was directed to anybody except the polytheistic Arabs, the polytheistic warring Arab tribes. They were content having the Zoroastrians, who were also monotheists, worshiping God in their way, and Christians, also monotheists, although distorted, they might say, worshiping God in their way. There was, in the beginning, no real sense of mission to them. It was, we need to get rid of, root out polytheism and worship the one God. Muhammad was born in 570. He was orphaned, he was poor, he was clever, he was honest, he was industrious. That was his reputation. He was also illiterate. He never learned to read. That doesn't mean he was unintelligent. He probably learned enough reading and writing to be able to do business well, because he was a caravan leader for a wealthy widowed businesswoman, Khadija, who Khadija asked him to marry her. She's the one who proposed. She was 40. He was 25. They had 4 daughters and 2 sons. Both sons died in infancy. She was the love of his life. While she was alive, he never looked anywhere else. Around age 35, he began to seek solitude and reflection. He had religious experiences, and an angel Gabriel revealing he should spread belief in the one God alone, and moral accountability, and afterlife, a reckoning, a judgment. And he was scared to death by this. He didn't want this. He was happy as a kind of a nice contemplative merchant. You know how we kind of want peaceful contemplation, and then what we seek peacefully sort of hits us right between the eyes? And I think that's kind of what happened to him. You know, a sense of union with God turned into a mission that he didn't really want. Because that mission wasn't to go and convert the Byzantine emperor. That mission was to take the message of one God to his own people. Now, naturally, they didn't like it. It was economically disastrous. Monotheism was economically disastrous for the Meccans. And so they fought him. They fought against him. This is in some ways where, you know, the prophet, as getting the reputation for being a warlike, you know, spreading the Islam by the sword, where that came up. But he was, he first of all, he was part of a warlike people, and I think there's a very interesting corollary to that. But they ran him out of town. Some had to flee, and they really persecuted those who said, yes, there is one God. Because Islam basically means one God rather than many. And they went to Abyssinia, Ethiopia, present-day Ethiopia first, and they developed a relationship with the Christian community there. And because, you know, they saw here were Christians believing and worshiping kind of the way that their fellow Meccans refused. After 11 years, Muhammad had a religious experience called the Mystical Night Journey, in which he was carried off in spirit to Jerusalem and then into heaven. And in 622, Muhammad and his followers were driven out of Mecca, found hospitality in Yathrib, which is Medina, that date marks the beginning of the Muslim calendar. Medinans, unlike the Meccans, generally accepted rule by a charter guaranteeing the rights of all. And the original Muslim principles were be at peace with the Jewish communities and the Christian communities. The Meccans, however, attacked 3 times, almost destroyed Islam. The peace treaty was broken by the Muslims and provoked an attack and victory by Muslims who regained Mecca, and Muhammad smashed the idols in the Kaaba. Continued to live in Medina, however. And fairly rapidly, once that core in Mecca had been destroyed of the idols there, the Arabian tribes began to unite. United, they were able to then begin to repel the Byzantine. And they made skirmishes into what is now Turkey, into the Byzantine Empire. They never got too far at that point, but they were causing problems on the borders with the Byzantine Empire. Muhammad made his last farewell, age of 63, died in 632. Images of Muhammad are forbidden lest they become objects of worship. Now, within the Byzantine church, there were, at that point, tremendous controversies around iconoclasm and around the use of images in worship. And a lot of the thinking of the iconoclasts was that these images became objects of worship, that making images was actually idolatry. And so that was a big controversy going on at the same time. I think they had influence on each other too. Let me just say a little word, sideline here, because I don't think it's in here, about the rapid spread of Islam. Once these Arabs were united, they were still a very formidable, warlike people. But instead of fighting one another, they had to find somebody to fight. The Byzantine armies were still strong enough they couldn't make a lot of headway. The Persians were strong enough they couldn't make a lot of headway. North Africa was a piece of rotten fruit just about to fall from the tree. Christianity was nominal there, but the Christian rulers were tyrants, despots, and there were all kinds of heresies and invasions from the Goths, the Visigoths, from Spain and Northern Europe. So the whole area of North Africa was socially, religiously, and politically weak. So this newly invigorated army, tribes of people, they could mow their way right through North Africa. St. Augustine's City of God was written basically as the barbarians from Europe were at the gates of Hippo and Carthage and that whole area. So, he is almost documenting there in the City of God the dissolution of the human city, the human empire under the force of the barbarians. Well, they wreaked their havoc, preparing then a disunified, dispirited people ready to welcome the conquest of the Arabs. And so they got well into Visigothic territory in Spain. Interestingly, the Christian character of the Visigoths was not Catholic. It was itself heretical. It was Arian, the Arian heresy, which was not that much different from Islam, because the Arian heresy denied the divinity of Christ. So, in a sense, they may also have found somewhat soul brothers there. I don't know. Okay. Origins of Islam in the Quran, revealed in small segments throughout Muhammad's life, reflecting primarily the situation of the moment. Reflects a misunderstanding of Christian teaching and the origins of the Bible. And there was, right from the start, debate about, even among Muslims, were these revelations universal or just for Arabs? Muhammad's illiteracy. Poetry. Poetry is the language of the illiterate. Because poetry is it's a memory help. So all of the characteristics of poetry, the meter, the rhyme, the plays on words, the relationships of words are all part of memory, of making memory, how would I say, conveying accuracy of what is received to what is given again, the correspondence of it. And Muhammad had, I guess, 13 wives after Khadijah. But every one of them had some kind of element of protecting the dignity of the woman. The last 11 were abandoned widows and divorced. And he basically married them to take them under his protection. So, you know, the tales of Muhammad being a sexual predator simply do not stand up to the, really don't stand up to the facts. However, the Quran limited it to 4. But polygamy was permitted, or is permitted still, in Islam, by Islam anyway, provided the man can support them and treat them equally, please. So,
Because it doesn't say well, it just says equally.
equally. However, there is plenty in the Quran about the good treatment of wives and women that was countercultural for the time. And there are studies on that. One of Aiden's mentors actually wrote a study on women in the Quran. And again, compared with the base idea of the woman as a man's property, there's a lot more equality in that. Now, right after Muhammad, he never appointed a successor. There was no central religious authority after him. The elected first 4 caliphs were elected more to provide political leadership than religious leadership. It was thought it wasn't really necessary to have religious leadership because monotheism is simply so simple. Just a certain set of obligations, personal obligations, adherence to a community, the ummah, and acknowledgement of one God. What more do you need? Well, so these political leaders that are listed there, they defeated the Persians, and then they began to split between those who had been elected and those who were descendants of Muhammad's son-in-law, who was the husband of Fatima. And that's the origin of the division between the Sunni and the Shia. Goes into dynasties. The Umayyads were first. They ruled from Damascus. And then the Abbasids conquered them and ruled from Baghdad. Northern Africa was conquered. Advance was halted at Poitiers in France in 732. 732, only 100 years after the death of Muhammad, and they were already in Poitiers, France. Then came a golden age of art and learning while the West was in the Dark Age, and it was Muslim scholars that preserved Aristotle for the scholastics in St. Thomas. Rival Muslim states developed, Mongols and Turks invaded, and they adopted Islam. There is a little story about the conversion of Russia. Vladimir sent his envoys to, should Vladimir and the Russians adopt Byzantine Christianity? Should they adopt Western Roman Christianity? Should they adopt Islam? Vladimir's emissaries went to Constantinople, saw Hagia Sophia, and they were bowled over. Nothing like it. This was heaven on earth. We must be this religion, was the message that they brought back. Vladimir accepted that, and the Russians became Christian. There was one other little element involved. Muslims forbade alcohol. Christians permitted vodka.
There it is.
So,
There you go.
Muslims permitted hashish. Crusades. There was an 11th century religious reform and revival in Europe. Weakened Byzantine Empire led to the desire to recapture holy places in Palestine. Actually, for the most part, the Muslims allowed relatively free access to the holy places for pilgrimage for Christians. But of course, it was still under their control. So there were authentic spiritual reasons. But the Crusades were not well organized for the most part, not well disciplined. And the Fourth Crusade was a total disaster, resulting in the sack and occupation of Constantinople, which we'll probably be learning a good bit more about on our trip. Then come the Turks. Two tribes from, well, there were many tribes, Turkish tribes, actually, from the Central Europe, the steppes of Central Asia, I'm sorry. And the Seljuks came first. We'll be running into a lot in central Turkey, a lot of Seljuk remnants, buildings. They were the ones actually that the Crusades fought. And the Ottomans then later succeeded in conquering the Seljuk Turks as well as pushing the Byzantine Empire basically into nothing more than Constantinople. And at its end, there was almost nothing left of the Byzantine Empire except Constantinople itself. And then Constantinople then fell in 1453. And the West did not come to its aid. 1453, the West was very occupied with its own internal squabbles, based also on that pesky Martin Luther and John Calvin and those folks up there. So they had their own problems. In 1571, the Battle of Lepanto, and then the Battle of Vienna in 1683, kind of marked the turning point in Ottoman expansion. The Ottomans never did get very far into North Africa, which remained under other Muslim control. But the whole rest of the Islamic world was pretty much dominated by the Ottoman Empire. And of course, they would have loved to move on, but they were having their own internal problems at that time too. You can look at this in both sides, and every time somebody gets power, they want to extend it. And that happened in the West as well as the East. So we can't demonize one side and glorify the other when both were doing the same damn thing. and that more than anything, is becoming the history, my view on the history of the human race, and our need for redemption that we cannot give ourselves. So this was the extent of the Ottoman Empire at the height of its power in 1683. So actually it did get most of North Africa. Okay, following World War I, basically the empire collapsed. It was on the verge of collapse a long time before that. In fact, I would say that the Armenian genocide in the very early part of the 20th century was also symptomatic of that collapse, and the kind of the out of control nature and how local antagonisms could turn massive, sadly. So Ataturk did something absolutely unique. Mustafa Kemal was his name. Ataturk was a title, the father of the Turks. He was the only resistance to the Allies carving up the Middle East after World War I. The Allies had their eyes on what is now Turkey, and there are maps showing what was to be left for the Turks, just a little bit, what was to be British protectorate, what was to be Italian, what was to be French, just like they did with every other country in the Middle East. And that carving up the Middle East is probably more than any other factor responsible for what has happened since then, including the terrible antagonisms of today. There's an interesting book that I've read parts of called "The Peace to End All Peace," which pretty much documents all of that negotiations between the victorious powers to carve out the Middle East, as well as punishing Germany. And I think most Arabs, certainly, most and many Muslims will see the creation of the State of Israel as interjecting into that territory as being simply a part of that European carving up of their land, and without their having anything to say about it. So that's, I think, also what gives birth to a lot of the antagonism, is that perception, which I think is not totally unfounded. So, another interesting thing, all of the Islamic dress, Sufism, were suppressed in a secular democratic republic, unified but secular, very European. And the current alphabet, Turkish alphabet, replaced the Arabic script. Overnight, January 1st, 1929. If you could not maneuver on that date with these strange-looking Western European characters, and notice some of them he borrowed from German and French, you were out of luck. Using Arabic script to write Turkish was prohibited by law and punishable. He couldn't get away with that today. What's interesting is if the world had applied the same standards to Ataturk that they apply to every other dictator, modern Turkey could not exist. It would have been divided up, because that kind of strength to build modern Turkey required a dictator. And best thing that he did, well, we'll get into a lot more of this. I think the best thing that Ataturk did was to die. He died young, in his early 50s, of cirrhosis of the liver. He was a very heavy drinker. And had he lived as long as Castro, the revolution would never have been finished. You know, because I think he was every bit as much of a dictator as any of them. But what he wanted was Turkey to come into the modern world, and it was by sometimes brutal means that he brought Turkey into the modern world. Okay. Mixed success, but I think it was successful. So Sunni and Shia Islam today. Sunnis are 85% majority. Shias are much more theocratic in their leadership, and they don't accept the Sunni traditions. Resurgence of Shias in Iran, 89%, Azerbaijan, 80%, Iran, 70% Iraq, 65% Lebanon. In the USA, 2% is Muslim, 15% are Shia. Little noticeable difference here. Radical Islam traces back to, in the late 1700s, the Wahhabism, puritanical sect of Sunnis, who violently opposed Shias and most other Sunnis as apostates and unbelievers. So it was, you know, a hammer to heresy within rather than an opposition outside. Radical Islam, stimulated by the artificial state boundaries created by European powers at the end of colonialism, and of course the State of Israel, all fed that fuel, fed the fire. But radical Islamists are more at war within Islam than they are at war with the West. And that long went unnoticed by the West. Why don't moderate Muslims speak out more firmly? Well, for one thing, mainstream Sunni Islam does not have a pope. There is no unified voice, in other words, to speak for Sunni Islam, to speak for moderate Islam. Extremists threaten them too. Individuals and groups do speak, sometimes forcefully. Their voice is often, these days, ignored by the media. And they themselves are preoccupied with defending themselves from attack by radicals. Fethullah Gulen, of whom I am very much an admirer, is seen as a voice for moderation within Islam, and he has established a movement. In fact, that movement, called the Gulen Movement, is behind the Pacifica Institute that sponsors those trips, orientation trips to Turkey that I was part of leading for priests, as well as many others. I think we're getting close to the end. So, within Islam, there really is the kind of tolerance that should come to the fore, even though, obviously, in many instances it isn't. Sufism, I think, is a very important thing that we as Christians can identify with, because it takes on a lot of the characteristics of Christian mysticism, including, as we will see, the whirling dervishes, which is a ritual of uniting heaven and earth within one's own mystical experience. Finally, it'll be interesting to see what Francis does. Because the string of popes, especially in the last half of this past century, have had a very special place in Turkey. Benedict XV, you see that picture there? That's a statue of Benedict XV. Outside, it's in triumphal posture, but it's outside the cathedral in Istanbul. It's the only monument to that Pope outside of the Vatican in the entire world. The Turks, and it's hard to get a handle on whether it was the initiative of the Sultan, who was definitely on his way out, or whether it was a Turkish group of citizens, wanted to erect this memorial, this monument to Benedict XV because of his peacemaking efforts during World War I. He's the only one who was, they were the only ones who recognized his largely unsuccessful movement towards trying to promote peace among the warring parties. A lot of Benedict's points were stolen by Wilson and his peace plan, which was unsuccessful too. John the 23rd, papal nuncio to Turkey. He's seen as a Turkish pope. We're going to visit his home, where he lived, where he ate, where he slept, where he studied in Istanbul, which to me is neat. Paul VI visited there in 1967, early in his papacy. We'll see some monuments of where he celebrated Mass. We will celebrate where they have been. John Paul II was there in 1979. Visited other Muslim countries, 2001, 2003. Benedict XVI, the first place that he went after he was elected, his first international trip was to Turkey. And he wanted to go the year he was elected, 2005. And the government bureaucracy did not enable that to happen. So he went in 2006. A part of that, of course, was that's the Patriarchate of Constantinople. So to do the reach out first to the Patriarch, representative of the Eastern Orthodox, was a big priority for Benedict XVI. And we are following in their footsteps.
All right.